On a Tuesday afternoon in Houston, a woman who earned $15.25 an hour stood in a basement archive holding a sealed envelope her mother had left her. 3 words were written on the front in fading blue ink: "Open when ready." She had carried that envelope for 9 years and had never once broken the seal. 11 miles away, in a glass office tower he no longer owned, a man who had sold 40 million records was signing away the last thing left to his name. They had never met. They had been carrying the same song for decades without knowing the other one existed. And in 41 days, a reel of magnetic tape recorded on the 9th of March, 1984, would do 2 things at the same moment. It would unravel a $44 million fraud built to look like bad luck, and it would finally tell a woman who her father was. She had been looking for him her whole life without knowing she was looking. She just did not have his name yet. Before we go any further, stay with this one all the way to the end. What happens between these 2 people is not what you think it is, and the moment you understand who they are to each other, you are going to want to start the story over from the beginning. So do me one small favor right now. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what the time is where you live. It means more than you know to picture this story reaching front porches and night shifts and kitchen tables all over the country, and I read every single comment that comes in. And if stories about dignity, family, and the second chances most people stop believing in are the kind of stories that stay with you, take 1 second to subscribe before we start. Because you are not going to want to miss what this woman finds behind a wall in an old recording studio in the 3rd Ward of Houston, Texas. The envelope lived in the bottom drawer of a metal desk in the basement of the Freedmen's Town Heritage Center, underneath a box of cotton gloves and a stack of acid-free folders, and Cassandra Delacroix took it out every morning before she did anything else. She did not open it. She held it for a moment, ran her thumb over the 3 words on the front, and put it back: "Open when ready." Her mother had written those words in October of 2016, 11 days before she died, and Cass had decided a long time ago that she was not ready yet. She was 41 years old. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain her mother had made, and she kept her hair wrapped in a cloth the color of river clay. She had worked at the Heritage Center for 6 years for $15.25 an hour, 28 hours a week, no benefits, and she loved it the way you love something that does not love you back in any way you can spend. The center sat on Emancipation Avenue in the 3rd Ward, in a narrow brick building that had once been a print shop run by a man whose name nobody had written down. Cass was the archivist. She was the only archivist. She was also the only person who knew where everything was. The basement smelled like old paper, which is a smell people think is dust, but is actually the paper itself slowly turning back into the trees it came from. Cass had read that somewhere. Acidic paper releases a faint vanilla scent as it breaks down, and she had learned to tell how old a document was by how sweet the box smelled when she opened it. The deed smelled the strongest. 1870s, 1880s, brittle as moth wings, the handwriting of people who had been born into one country and freed into another, and had bought land with money they pooled dollar by dollar. She handled those pages the way you handle the hand of someone in a hospital bed, carefully, and like it mattered. She was behind on her rent by 3 months. Her apartment on Truxillo Street cost $1,140 a month, and her landlord had slid a notice under her door on the 4th of the month, printed on yellow paper, the kind of yellow that is supposed to mean caution. She had $211 in her checking account. She had a part-time job she could not afford to lose and could not afford to keep. She did the math the way her mother had taught her, sitting at the kitchen table with the bills laid out in a row, and the math did not work, and she went to work anyway. That morning, Cass was digitizing a collection of photographs from the first Juneteenth celebrations held in the ward. She set each one on the scanner glass, closed the lid, waited for the green bar to cross the screen, and lifted the lid again. June 19th, 1865. That was the day Major General Gordon Granger stood in Galveston and read General Order No. 3, telling the enslaved people of Texas that they were free. 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had already said so. The order had taken that long to arrive. Freedom had been the law for 900 days before anyone bothered to write it down to the people it belonged to. Cass scanned a photograph of a crowd in a park, men in Sunday women in white, a banner she could not read strung between 2 oak trees. She knew the park. It was Emancipation Park, 11 blocks from where she sat, and she knew the story because she had filed the story. In 1872, a group of formerly enslaved men, led by a reverend and a man named Jack Yates, had pooled together $800 and bought 10 acres of land so that Black Houstonians would have somewhere to gather on Juneteenth, because they were not allowed in the white parks. They bought freedom a second time with cash, because the first kind had not come with anywhere to stand. It became the oldest public park in Texas, Cass scanned the photograph and saved the file, and did not let herself cry over a JPEG at 9 in the morning. She hummed while she worked. She always had. It was a slow tune, 6 notes that climbed and then came back down like something settling onto water. And she did not know its name and had never heard it anywhere but her own mouth. Her mother used to hum it while she cooked. Once, when Cass was small, she had asked where the song came from, and Odessa had stopped stirring the pot and looked out the window for a long moment and said, "That is your father's song, baby." And when Cass asked who her father was, Odessa had said, "A man who could make a room go quiet," and had gone back to stirring, and never said another word about it as long as she lived. Cass had spent 30 years humming a song she could not name, written by a man she had never met, for a reason she did not understand. She had been looking for him her whole life without knowing she was looking. She just did not have his name yet. She kept the song the way she kept the envelope, close and unopened, a thing she would understand someday when someday came. At 10:47 that morning, her supervisor came down the basement stairs with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that Cass had learned to read. The look meant something had been lost. The center had been trying for 2 years to get historic landmark protection for the buildings still standing in Freedmen's town, the real ones, the ones built by hands that had been freed and not much else. There were only a few left. Most had been torn down for townhouses with rooftop decks and rents nobody on Emancipation Avenue could pay. One of the last ones was Crescent Sound, a recording studio on Andrew Street that had been shuttered for years, its windows papered over, its name still ghosted on the brick above the door. A holding company had filed for a demolition permit. The permit had cleared review. The building had 41 days before the machines came. Cass looked at the address on the screen. She did not know yet that the man who had built that studio had recorded a song there on the 9th of March, 1984, a slow tune with 6 notes that climbed and came back down. She did not know that she had been humming it her whole life. She set down the photograph of the park, picked up her gloves, and started counting the days. Lamar Toussaint was born in 1968 in a shotgun house on Lyons Avenue in the 5th Ward, the part of Houston people called the Bloody Nickel back then, and the first instrument he ever touched was a guitar with 5 strings that his grandfather kept on the porch. His grandfather, Percy Toussaint, had hands like roots and a voice he only used for hymns. Every evening after his shift at the rail yard, Percy sat on the porch in the heat and played the same 3 chords and told the boy that music was not something you owned, it was something you passed. You catch it from somebody, he said, and you carry it, and then you give it to somebody else. That porch was where everything important happened. It was where Lamar learned that a sad song and a true song were usually the same song. By the time he was 30, he had made 2 of them famous. By 40, he had built Crescent Sound Records into the most successful Black-owned label in the South, and his own voice, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who could make a room go quiet, sold 40 million records across 4 decades. He had a catalog appraised at 3,212 met. He had a foundation with his name on it. He had a glass office in a tower downtown, a wife named Celeste who wore his success better than he did, and a son named Julian who had a business degree and called him Sir. He had one sister, Erline. She was 9 years older, and she had raised him after their mother went to work the night shift at a cannery and mostly did not come back from the version of her life that started after that. Erline had fed him and walked him to school and sat in the front pew when he played his first paying gig at a church on Jensen Drive. And when the money came, Lamar had quietly stopped returning her calls because Erline still lived 8 blocks from where they grew up, and Erline still said grace over canned beans, and Erline reminded him of a poverty he had spent his whole life outrunning. He told himself he was busy. He sent a check every December. He had not heard her voice in 6 years. Bertrand Sloan had managed Lamar's money for 19 years. He was the kind of man who remembered your wife's birthday and the name of your first producer, and he understood that the surest way to steal from a man is to become the person that man does not feel he needs to watch. Lamar did not read contracts. He signed where the little flags were stuck to the page, and he signed because Bert told him to, and he had been signing for 19 years and every number had always been right. That was the trap. Trust is not built. It is accumulated, slowly, until one day there is enough of it stacked up to bury a man. It worked the way these things work, quietly, and then all at once. Bert had used Lamar's catalog as collateral on a line of credit Lamar barely understood, and he had funneled $44 million through a shell called the Crescent Youth Music Initiative, a program inside the foundation that existed only on paper, that taught no children, that was an address and a bank account and nothing else. He had pledged the master recordings, the original tapes, the actual sound of Lamar's life, as security against debt Lamar did not know he carried. And buried in a 2019 amendment, Lamar had signed at a charity gala with a glass of wine in his other hand, was a copyright assignment that Bert had since forged forward, transferring ownership of the early Crescent Sound catalog into an entity Bert controlled. When the loans came due, the catalog was seized. The foundation was frozen. Celeste filed for separation through an attorney who specialized in protecting the spouse who saw it coming, and her assets, separate for 22 years, were never in question. Julian took a seat on the restructured foundation board, the side with the money, and explained to a reporter that the family was cooperating fully. He did not call his father. Lamar walked out of a meeting on a Thursday holding a folder, and by the following Thursday, he had a rental car, a room at an extended stay motel off the Gulf Freeway for $312 a week, and the only thing nobody had thought to take because it was worth nothing to them. He still had the keys to Crescent Sound. He drove to Andrew Street on the 19th day. He told himself he wanted to see the building before they tore it down. The truth was simpler and harder than that. He had nowhere else that still knew his name. He sat in the rental car across the street and looked at the brick and the ghost of the letters above the door, and he could not make himself go in, and so he just sat, the way men sit when the thing they built is about to be unbuilt. That was when he saw the woman with the clipboard. She had a Heritage Center lanyard and a cloth wrapped around her hair and a way of standing in front of the building like she was apologizing to it. He watched her for a while. Then he got out of the car because 40 years of being someone makes it hard to sit in a parking spot being no one, and he crossed the street and asked her what was going to happen to the building. Her name was Cass, she said. She was trying to save it. She did not know who he was, and he did not tell her, and there was a relief in that so deep it surprised him. She let him hold the other end of her measuring tape. She let him carry a box of files from her trunk to the tips. She talked to him like he was a man helping her, not a man who used to matter. And for the first time in 19, something in his chest unclenched a quarter of an inch. And then she hummed. She did it without thinking, the way she always did. Bent over a box on the studio steps. 6 notes that climbed and came back down like something settling onto water. Lamar went still. He knew that song. He had written that song. He had written it in this building on the 9th of March, 1984, for a woman in the choir on Jensen Drive named Odessa, who had laughed at his good suit and made him forget he was poor for one whole spring, and who had stopped returning his calls before he ever knew why. He had never recorded it for anyone. He had sung it exactly once into a microphone, late at night, for himself. He looked at the woman humming his secret on the steps of his dying building, and he did not say a word. He came back the next morning. He told her he had time on his hands, which was the truest thing he had said to anyone in weeks. And Cass handed him a pair of cotton gloves and showed him how to hold a photograph by its edges. They worked side by side in the basement of the Heritage Center for the better part of a week. He learned the smell of the deeds. He learned that you never write on an original, that you log everything in pencil, that the past is held together by people willing to do for almost no money. Us. Cass did not ask him much. She had learned a long time ago that people who are carrying something heavy will set it down when they are ready and not a minute before, and that the kindest thing you can do is keep the room warm and the coffee coming and your questions to yourself. She gave him the chair that did not wobble. She split her lunch with him without making it a thing, half a turkey sandwich on a paper towel, and when he tried to refuse it, she said her mother always cooked for one more than was coming. And that was the end of the discussion. She fed him the way her mother had fed strangers, not because they had earned it, but because feeding people was simply what you did when you had a kitchen and somebody had a hunger. She was risking more than she let on. The Heritage Center board had told her to focus on the grant paperwork and let the Crescent Sound building go, because fighting a cleared demolition permit was a fool's errand, and the center could not afford a fool's errand. Cass had kept working the building anyway. She came in on her unpaid days. She drove to the county clerk's office on her own gas and pulled the chain of title on the property, going back parcel by parcel, because she had a feeling about that building she could not explain. She did not know the man drinking her coffee had recorded the soundtrack of a generation behind that brick. She only knew the building mattered, and that mattering was worth her $31 of gas. On the 4th day, she told him about the masters. She had found in the property records a reference to a 1987 equipment lien filed by Crescent Sound Records, and it had sent her down a road she did not fully understand. So she said it out loud, the way she said everything out loud, to figure out what she thought. There are 2 things you can own in a song, she told him. There is the composition, the words and the melody, and that is publishing. And there is the master, the actual recording, the specific performance captured on tape, the thing you hear. They are owned separately, and for most of the last century, the people who made the music owned neither. The label fronted the money to record, and called that money in advance, and then charged every cost of making and selling the record back against the artist's share, and that was called recoupment, and the math was built, so the artist almost never recouped. The label kept the masters forever. The artist kept the fame, and a statement that always said zero. Lamar listened to a woman explain to him the machine that had eaten so many of the men his grandfather used to play with, men who had voices like rivers and died owning nothing but the clothes they were buried in. He had spent his whole career trying to build a label that did the opposite. Crescent Sound had given its artists their masters back after 7 years. Every one of them, a thing the big labels called insane, and Lamar called the only kind of building worth doing. And now a man named Bert had used the very mechanism Lamar had fought his whole life to find the seam in his own house and walk out with the one thing Lamar had sworn no one would ever take from the people who made it. The irony sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He did not tell her that either. Because that night, in the motel room off the Gulf Freeway, Lamar did the thing he had been afraid to do. He pulled the cardboard box he had taken from the studio out of the trunk and opened it on the bed under the lamp. Session logs, spiral notebooks, the handwriting of his younger self, who logged every take in a code only he could read. He found the page from March of 1984. 2 columns of takes, a tune with no title, and in the margin, in his own hand, 4 letters and a name. For Odessa D. He sat on the edge of a $312 a week bed and did the arithmetic that fathers are never supposed to have to do. The dates lined up, the name lined up. The song that woman had been humming over a box of photographs was a song he had written for her mother in a year before that woman was born. He understood, sitting there, what it meant. He understood that the woman who had split her sandwich with him and given him the chair that did not wobble was almost certainly his daughter. And he made a decision he would spend a long time defending to himself. He decided not to tell her. Not yet. Not like this. Because Lamar Toussaint knew exactly what he was. He was a man whose name had just become a liability, whose face was in the paper next to the word fraud, who had nothing left to offer a long-lost daughter except the wreckage of a fortune and a seat at a table that had been flipped over. If he told her now, he would never know. He would never know whether she stayed because he was her father, or because the word father came attached to 40 million records and a building worth saving. He had spent his whole life being loved for what he was worth, by a wife, by a son, by everyone but his grandfather and a woman named Odessa. He did not want to do that to this one. He wanted to know, before she knew anything, whether the kindness was real. He told himself it was for her. Part of it was. The other part was a man too proud and too wounded to be seen as a rescue. So he came back the next morning with 2 coffees and said nothing. He held photographs by their edges. He logged everything in pencil. He watched his daughter fight to save the building where he had written her into existence, and he let her think he was just a man with time on his hands. And somewhere underneath the silence, a clock he could not see had already started counting down toward the day the silence would cost him. On the 33rd day, Cass found the wall. She had gotten the center's board to let her inside Crescent Sound for one afternoon to photograph the interior for the landmark application, and Lamar had given her the keys without explaining how he had them, and she had not asked, because she had decided not to ask. The studio was a tomb of better days. Egg crate foam peeling off the walls, a mixing console under a bed sheet, a live room where the carpet still held the shape of where a piano used to stand. Cass moved through it with her camera and her flashlight in a reverence she could not account for. And in the back, in the old tape vault, she noticed that one section of shelving sat 4 inches proud of the others. She was an archivist. She knew what it meant when something did not sit flush. People hide what they cannot bear to lose and cannot bear to look at, and they hide it badly. She pulled the shelf away from the wall. Behind it was a cavity, and in the cavity was a single reel of 2-inch tape in a white box, and a spiral session ledger, and the dust on both was 30 years thick. The box had a strip of masking tape across the front. The handwriting was small and slanted and careful. Untitled, it said, 030984. And under that, 2 words. Faroka stood in the dark of a building that was scheduled to die in 8 days, and held in her gloved hands the only copy of a song she had been humming since before she had words for it. She did not understand it yet, but she understood the date, and she understood the handwriting matched the session ledger, and she understood that the ledger was signed on its first page by the man who had founded Crescent Sound Records. And a name on a deed is a name on a deed. The founder's name was Lamar Toussaint. She had read it that morning in the chain of title. She had spent 6 days splitting her sandwich with a man who had never told her his last name. She drove home with the box on the passenger seat like it was a person. That was the night she opened the envelope. She had carried it for 9 years because she had never felt ready, and she understood now. Sitting at her own kitchen table on Truxillo Street with the bills still laid out in their row, that ready was not a feeling that arrived. It was a thing you decided. She slid her thumb under the flap her mother's tongue hid in 2016 and broke it. Inside were three things. A photograph of a young woman in a choir robe laughing at something outside the frame. A single sheet of paper with 6 lines of melody drawn by hand and a lyric underneath and the initials LT. And the words for Odessa, 1984. And a letter 2 pages in the handwriting Cass had inherited and never noticed she had inherited. Her mother's letter did not bury the thing. It said it in the second sentence. Your father is a man named Lamar Toussaint. Odessa wrote that she had loved him one spring when they were both young and poor and singing in the same church, and that he had been climbing towards something she could feel pulling him up and away even then, and that when she found out she was carrying Cass, she had made a choice. She did not tell him. She wrote that she would not be the woman who reached up and pulled a rising thing back down to earth, that she had seen what it did to a man to be held responsible for a life before he had finished building his own, and that she had decided her daughter would be loved completely by one person who chose to stay, rather than partly by one who was made to. She wrote that it was the proudest and the loneliest decision of her life. She wrote that she might have been wrong. She wrote, at the end, that she had kept his song so that Cass would always carry a piece of him even before she carried his name, and that when the day came that Cass was ready, she would know what to do with it. Cass put her face in her hands at her own kitchen table and cried the way you cry for 2 people at once, the mother who carried it alone and the father who never got the chance. She went to the studio the next morning before it was light. Lamar was already there, sitting on the steps in the gray, 2 coffees beside him, the way he had been for 6 days. She sat down. She put the white tape box between them. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You knew." He did not pretend not to understand. That was the one mercy he gave them both. He said yes. He told her he had found it in the session log on the 4th night, that he had known almost since the beginning, that he had decided to stay quiet because he could not stand the thought of her loving him for what was left of his name, instead of for the man on the steps with no name at all. He said it badly. He said it like a man who had rehearsed it and lost the rehearsal the moment her face was in front of him. And Cass, who had spent 6 days being kind to a stranger and one night learning he was her father, felt the particular grief of a kindness that had been watched. She had given him her sandwich and her chair and her hours, and he had known, and he had let her give them to a stranger when she could have been giving them to her father. He had taken something even by trying to protect it. She told him so. He did not defend himself. He just said, "Your mother made the same kind of choice. She thought she was protecting you too." They sat with that. The light came up over Andrew Street. Somewhere down the block, a bus exhaled at a stop. 2 people who had been carrying the same song from opposite ends of 40 years sat on the steps of the building where it was written, and the silence between them stopped being a thing he was keeping and started being a thing they were holding together. Then Lamar looked at the white box and at the ledger under her arm, and something in his face changed from a father to a man who had spent his life around tape. "There is something you do not understand about what you found," he said. "That tape is not on any list anyone seized, and that ledger says who really owns this building. Cass, this is not just your father's song. This is the thing that ends Bert." The attorney's name was Theo Castile, and Cass already knew him, which was the whole reason any of it was possible. The Heritage Center had retained Theo 2 years earlier to clear the rights on a collection of old gospel recordings they wanted to digitize, and he had done it for a quarter of his rate because his grandmother was buried 3 blocks from the office. Theo was 61. He had spent 30 years as a music copyright attorney, watching the same theft happen to the same kind of people in 1,000 different fonts, and he had learned that the documents almost never lie, even when everyone holding them does. Cass brought him the ledger and the tape and the story, all 3, on a Monday. Theo listened without writing anything down, which Cass would learn was how he listened when something mattered. Then he put on reading glasses and read the ledger for 2 hours and said one thing: "This changes what we can prove." He explained it to them slowly, the way you explain a thing you need someone to be able to repeat under oath. Bert's whole scheme rested on a 2019 document that claimed Lamar had assigned the early Crescent Sound catalog into an entity Bert controlled. The seizure, the foreclosure, the whole collapse, all of it stood on the assumption that the assignment was complete. But the ledger in Cass's hands was a contemporaneous business record, dated and signed across 30 years, that documented who had actually owned every master Crescent Sound ever cut. And the reel she had pulled from behind the wall was a master that did not appear on a single inventory Bert had ever filed, because Bert had not known it existed. A catalog assignment that claims to be complete and is not is a document a forensic examiner can start pulling apart. That was the seam. Theo found the rest of the way in through the money. He pulled 5 years of royalty statements and foundation filings and laid them across the conference table, and he taught Cass and Lamar to read them the way he read them. Look at the recoupment column, he said. Look at how the cost charged against the catalog spike in the exact quarters that the Crescent Youth Music Initiative reports new expenditures. The initiative was a 501c3, a tax-exempt charity, and a charity has to file a public form every year called a 990 that lists what it spent and on whom. The initiative's 990s listed $44 million in program expenses across 5 years and zero children served, zero classes held, zero employees beyond a single director who shared a home address with one of Bert's shell companies. Charity fraud is not a clever crime, Theo said. It is a loud crime that nobody listens to, because the people who would notice trust the word charity to mean what it says. The case did not move fast at first, and then it moved all at once. Theo brought it to a former colleague who now worked white-collar cases for the U.S. Attorney's office, a woman who had been looking for 2 years for exactly this kind of paper trail and exactly this kind of witness. Because most victims of financial fraud do not know they are victims. They think the market turned. They think they failed. Lamar had spent a year believing he had failed. The ledger told a different story, and the master behind the wall told it in a voice no spreadsheet could argue with. And the woman at the U.S. Attorney's office understood within an hour that she finally had her case. Bertrand Sloan was arrested on a Wednesday morning. He was not a cartoon. He cried in the hallway of the federal building, and what he said while he cried was that he had only meant to borrow it, that he had always intended to put it back, which is the thing every man like Bert says. Right up until the morning, the borrowing is a number, and the number has handcuffs. He was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, 4 counts of money laundering, and 2 counts of charity fraud. The catalog was unfrozen. The forged assignment was voided. The masters came home. Not all of it came back. It never does. Of the $44 million Bert had moved, the receiver recovered $19 million because the rest had been spent or hidden or moved somewhere the law could not reach fast enough. Lamar got back the catalog, the studio, and a fraction of the fortune he had lost. He was not a billionaire again. He was a man in his late 50s with his life's work returned to his hands, and a building on Andrews Street, the demolition order had been lifted off with 4 days to spare. And here is what he did not do. He did not write his daughter a check. He had spent his whole life learning, too late, that the people who love you for a check do not stay when the check stops. And he was not going to handcast the one thing that had poisoned every other relationship he had. Instead, on a Tuesday evening, at the kitchen table on Truxillo Street, he unrolled a different kind of document. Plans. The Crescent Sound Building restored, made into something with 2 names over the door. A working studio on the ground floor where young artists could record and keep their own masters, the way Lamar's label had always done it. An archive on the 2nd floor, run by Cass, where the recorded history of Black Houston, the gospel and the blues and the Zydeco and the screw tapes, would be preserved by the one person who understood that the past is held together by unglamorous work in a cold room. A fund, seated with the recovered royalties, that gave 4 young musicians a year the thing Lamar had never had at their age, which was a lawyer in the room when they signed. Cass looked at the plans for a long time. She looked at the name on top. She said, "You put her first." Lamar said, "She carried it the longest, Odessa first, Toussaint second." The way it should have been from the start. Because the woman who sang the song in a kitchen for 30 years and asked no one for anything had earned the right to go first. And the man who left was only now learning that going second is its own kind of grace. Celeste did not come to any of it. She read about the acquittal of the catalog in the business section, the same place she had read about its loss, and somewhere across town she sat in an apartment she had protected perfectly and discovered that a thing protected perfectly and shared with no one is just a thing you are alone with. Julian read it too, and Julian, unlike his mother, sat with his phone in his hand for a long time and started, for the first time in a year, to do the arithmetic of what he had chosen. They opened the doors on the 19th of June. It was not an accident. Cass had pushed for the date the way she pushed for everything, quietly and without quitting, because she wanted the building to come back to life on the day Black Texas had been told it was free. The brick of Andrews Street had been cleaned but not erased, the way you clean a grave and leave the name. Above the door, in letter from steel and lit from beneath, were 2 words that had never stood together before. Odessa first, Toussaint second. A woman who had passed in 2016 and had her name on a building on the morning of the holiday her grandparents' grandparents had advanced to hear about 160 years before. The street filled up by noon. There were folding tables and red drinks and a man selling boudin out of a cart, and there were people from the ward who had recorded in the old studio when they were young and had not set foot on the block in 20 years. Cass moved through it in a dress the color of river clay, and she was tired in the way you are tired after building something instead of after losing it, which is a different country of tired entirely. She had a salary now, $41,000 a year, archive director, with benefits, and she had paid her back rent and kept the apartment on Truxillo Street because some things you keep, not because you have to, but because they kept you. Lamar played that afternoon. He had not performed in 2 years and he did not announce it. He just sat down at a battered upright they had moved into the live room, let the door stand open to the street. He played the 3 chords his grandfather used to play on a porch in the 5th Ward. And then he played the song. The one with 6 notes that climbed and came back down like something settling onto water. The one he had written in that room on the 9th of March, 1984, for a woman in a choir robe. The one his daughter had been humming her whole life without knowing whose breath it had first been carried on. Cass stood in the doorway and listened to her own lullaby come back to her in her father's hands. The song had traveled from a porch to a studio, from a studio to a kitchen, from her mother's mouth to her own, across a hurricane of years and a wall of silence, and the death of the only person who knew the whole of it, and it had come home. Nobody in that room knew what they were hearing except the 2 of them. That was all right. The best things are usually witnessed by fewer people than they deserve. Erline came. Lamar had written to her, by hand, a letter that took him drafts and said in plain words the thing he had spent 6 years too proud to say, which was that he was sorry, and that he was poorer now and somehow less ashamed, and that there was a chair for her if she wanted it. She wrote back 2 lines and came on the bus. She was 70 now, smaller than he remembered, and when she saw him in his apron behind the table, she did not make a speech either. She just took his face in her 2 hands, the way she had when he was a boy with a guitar that had 5 strings, and she said, "There you are," like he had been the one who was lost, which he had been. Julian came too. He did not call ahead. He took an Uber to Andrew Street and stood on the sidewalk in good shoes and looked at the sign, at his father's name, sitting second, behind a name he had never heard, and something deep in him turned over that had been frozen for a year. He had grown up watching Tucson go first on everything. Here it went second, on purpose, behind a woman his father had chosen to honor over himself. Julian did not have a word for what that was. He walked in anyway. He found his father in the studio, and he did not say sorry, because some sorries are too big for the mouth, so he did the other thing the men in that family did instead of talking. He picked up a road case of cables that needed moving, and he moved it. He stayed until the lights went down. He coiled cords and stacked chairs and worked beside his father in the loud and the heat the way Percy Tucson had once fixed the things that broke without ever once calling it love. Celeste did not come. There was a chair near the front that Cass had set out without saying who it was for, and it stayed empty all day. And that was its own kind of answer. Not every thread gets tied. Some people protect themselves so well that they end up the only thing they have left to protect. That is not the story's failure. That is the story. When the street had emptied and the building was quiet and the steel letters hummed faintly over the door, Cass and Lamar sat on the studio steps, the same steps where she had hummed a song to a stranger 33 days into the rest of both their lives. They had a long time. Say it now. Lamar had once owned $312 and a wife and a son and a name that opened every room in the city. And a man he trusted had walked out the back of his life with all of it. The papers had called it a collapse. But the contracts and the trust and the carefree prenuptial structure and the foundation built to do good had all been walls, and walls keep things out until the day they keep you in, alone, with everything you protected and no one to hand it to. What saved him was not on paper. It was a song his grandfather caught from somewhere and passed to him, that he passed to a woman, that she passed to a daughter, that the daughter carried back to him on the steps of a dying building because she did not calculate what he was worth. She calculated what he needed. A coffee, a chair that did not wobble, somebody to show up tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. The legacy that lasted was not the one filed with the county. It was the one nobody could foreclose on. 6 notes that climbed and came back down, and a name spoken out loud at last with love. This story is fiction. Lamar, Cass, Odessa, and the building on Andrew Street do not exist, but almost everything underneath them does. Juneteenth, the day this story opens its doors, was only made a federal holiday in 2021, 156 years after the people of Galveston first heard the words. Freedmen's Town in Houston was built by formerly enslaved people who laid the brick of its streets by hand, and much of it has been lost to demolition, block by block in living memory. And the heartbreak at the center of this story, an artist who creates the work of a lifetime and ends up owning none of it, is not a plot device. It has happened to a staggering number of the musicians whose voices shaped the last 100 years, many of whom died with their names on the records and nothing in their pockets. I wrote this one because I keep thinking about the difference between what we protect on paper and what actually holds us up when the paper burns. A contract can be forged, a trust can be drained, but a song your mother hummed over a stove, carried for 30 years by someone who asked for nothing, turns out to be the one thing no one can foreclose on. That seemed worth 8,000 words to me. So let me ask you something before you go. Is there someone in your life who walked away when you had nothing, the way Julian walked away from his father? And if that person showed up again, not because they owed you, not because there was anything left to take, but because they were finally ready to stand in the doorway and stay, would you let them pick up the cables and get to work beside you? Or would you keep the chair empty, the way Celeste's chair stayed empty, because some doors close from the inside and never open again? There is no wrong answer. Both of those are real. I have lived on both sides of that doorway, and I suspect you have too. And here is the other question, the one this whole story was really asking. When everything you own can be taken in a single afternoon by a man with a pen, what is the thing they cannot reach? For Lamar, it was 6 notes and a daughter's voice. For Odessa, it was a choice she made out of love and carried alone for 30 years. What is it for you? What is the song nobody can foreclose on? Tell me down in the comments. Tell me about the person who showed up for you when the room was empty and everyone else had left. I read them. I read all of them, and they are the reason I keep telling these stories. If this one moved you, do me the small kindness of letting me know you were here. Drop a comment, even one word. Hit that like button so the next person scrolling at midnight, tired, behind on the rent, wondering if showing up still matters, gets shown this story instead of one more thing designed to make them feel small. Subscribe if you have not yet, and turn on the notifications, because we tell a story like this every week, and I would hate for you to miss the next one. And if there is someone you have been meaning to call, someone who once showed up for you and never asked to be paid back, maybe today is the day you send them this and tell them you remember. Stay kind, stay blessed, and never underestimate the power of one quiet act of love.